Hello there, this is Dr. K. Paul Stoller, and the video you are about to watch is part 2 of The Great Democide, a perspective I wrote for a peer-reviewed journal. It is a decarbonizing agenda, an anti-terraforming religion where carbon dioxide will be removed from the atmosphere in the name of being green. Green was intended to be the new anti-human, anti-science religion used to isolate, control, and eventually eliminate as much as 80% of the human population on the planet, for the carbon they really want to remove is us. If green were really green, why are we outsourcing our energy needs to China, where slaves are many and human rights are few? Those batteries for electric cars require cobalt mined by exploited African children. Who do you think are making all those Chinese solar panels? Yes, they make most of them. How about 1 million Uyghur Muslim slaves incarcerated because of their religion, at least until someone with money needs an organ that matches one of the slaves, be they Muslim or Falun Gong practitioners? It's called greenwashing or environmental virtue signaling. By 2026, there will be more than 3 Chinese males for every female aged 15 to 29, thanks to their policy of sex-selective abortion. The Chinese gender gap is fueling the trafficking of poor women, who are being kidnapped or lured into China and forced to be prostitutes or slave brides. This is an unspoken driver of Chinese policy. A massive global death cult has been lurking for decades for the moment to strike. They actually believe they could transcend carbon-based life and have their consciousness transferred to some silicon-based life form. In the short term, their plan is to neutralize the USA with a civil war economic collapse, while China takes over the South China Sea, including Taiwan. Whether you personally believe in malevolence, Satan, or nasty interdimensionals is your choice, but the globalists believe in them, and most have sold their proverbial souls for something they already had, and now they have created a covenant with the losing team. The weird thing is, on some level they know it, but can't stop themselves. So they push forward with their deranged game plans to create a transhuman world where most humans have been eliminated, and they want this all to happen by 2030, according to their own published agenda. A world that will be free of poverty and hunger because we won't be in it, but those who remain will own nothing, be happy, and eat bugs. Again, this plan has been cooking for the last century. The globalists' desire to be top dogs on a prison planet is so intense their wish may actually be granted, but not on this earth. That seems to be the way a benevolent universe works. You get what you want eventually, but it may not be exactly how you planned it out. Be that as it may, there also seems to be a lot of malevolence tolerated at certain levels and layers of our reality, undoubtedly to stir the evolutionary pot for the benefit of all. Nevertheless, what goes around comes around. So, if true, you don't trade your future for temporary misuse of power, as seductive as it may be. It is a poor choice, but some insist on learning the hard way, yet even in their insanity, the lessons they offer benefit the whole. Medical tyranny and soft-kill weapons. Fluoride seems to have been the first foray into medical tyranny to control populations. The historical use of fluoride for behavior control probably started in the Soviet gulags in the 1930s, but Nazi Germany was quick to apply same in their prison camps, as the mineral makes humans apathetic and easy to dominate, stupid and docile. The propaganda campaign in the USA was so convincing that fluoride was essential for preventing tooth decay that anyone who questioned its use in the water supply, even though fluoride is more poisonous than lead, was considered a nutcase. The book The Fluoride Deception is well researched and goes over this in detail. Christopher Bryson is the author. The practice and paradigm of fluoridating municipal drinking water demonstrated that the public would accept drinking poison if the government insisted it was a public health measure being done for the benefit of citizens' well-being. Für Ihre Sicherheit. It's for your safety, a common Nazi reframe. This poison is still universally defended by the dentists, who will willingly put the most poisonous non-radioactive element on the periodic table in your mouth, mercury amalgam fillings, and call it silver. The mercury is constantly leaching out, and you breathe it in and swallow it too. During World War II, the biowarfare activities of the Japanese were particularly atrocious. As many as 3,000 Allied troops lost their lives in places such as the infamous Unit 731 testing biologics, an untold number of civilians when these agents were released in Asia. The USA covertly granted the scientists involved immunity, not unlike Operation Paperclip, that brought back over 30,000 Nazi scientists and technocrats to the USA and then seated them in various governmental agencies and programs. Blame it on the fluoridated water, but we have allowed ourselves to be experimented on far too easily and without holding anyone accountable. There is no freedom without accountability. In 1950, the U.S. Army sprayed the bacteria Serratia marcescens in San Francisco from boats in the bay, Operation Sea Spray, and continued till 1969. There was at least one documented death from the infections that followed. Infantile paralysis, or polio, didn't exist until the heavy use of various pesticides, the most notable being DDT, which is required to weaken the immune system so a previously benign stomach virus could start causing paralysis. But the government had encouraged and required the liberal use of DDT, and it was used everywhere, and on almost everything, still is in certain parts of the world. Nevertheless, a virus, and only a virus, would be blamed for what was actually an illness caused by a pesticide, or else there would be great liability to both the government and industry. So, fear of a virus was ginned up. Sound familiar? The mass vaccination campaign, polio, initially gave 98 million Americans a retrovirus infection, a simian virus, SV40, now known to be causally related to several types of cancer. Now it seems genetic sequences from SV40 are in the mRNA bioweapon for COVID. Don't misunderstand what I have said here. An enterovirus causes the illness, but it needs a toxic cofactor in most cases. If the truth of the toxic cause of polio was known and the government held accountable for infecting millions with a cancer-causing retrovirus, we would not be where we are today. The first mass vaccination program for polio in the USA, now called the Cutter Incident, gave 200,000 children polio. To convince the public the polio vaccine program was working, the definition of polio was changed so that one had to be paralyzed for at least 60 days to be classified as polio. Most cases resolved before 60 days, and of course they knew that. It made the vaccine look very effective. Today, the definition of what is a vaccine has been redefined to accommodate a hard-to-sell, problematic gene transfer therapy that makes the human body create a pathogenic protein, forever in some people, potentially sterilize many recipients and inflame their hearts. Make the human body produce a pathogenic spike protein. What could go wrong? Oh, and the definition of gain of function was changed as well, so the reader can decide if that made Dr. Fauci look any more credible. Especially when it was found he wanted EcoHealth Alliance to spray more virulent coronavirus in Wuhan caves to infect the local population. The Pentagon refused to fund the project, maybe because it was an act of war. Made in the USA. By masking biowarfare programs as public health measures producing vaccines, these fools were able to get around restrictions. The Department of Defense, DoD, DARPA, admitted to operating 46 biolabs in Ukraine, for public health of course, but pay no attention to the fact we operate these labs all over the world. We are the good guys. In 2012, DARPA developed their ADEPT Protect project that would use gene-encoded vaccines to stop a pandemic. They would create. There was no warp speed program. They had already been working on this for 10 years before Trump announced warp speed. Moderna got its first contract in 2013, but it was the DoD that came up with the idea of mRNA vaccines. This whole thing has been a military operation from the get-go. By 2015, the peer-reviewed literature had articles announcing the enhanced CoV-2 was ready to be used on the human population. It was never a China virus. The Wuhan lab was just enhancing what was created in the USA. With the first week, thousands of pregnant women were taking this vaccine. Never have we given experimental vaccines to pregnant women, and in the past, medicine went out of its way to protect pregnant women from as much as possible, and certainly not interventions that would upset their immune systems, but medicine was now neutered. Only pharmakeia existed and was in full control. The polio outbreak showed that you could herd the sheep, humans in this case, into a slaughterhouse if there was an invisible enemy, and a virus is perfect for that because one can use fear to get populations to turn to their government to protect them from this invisible enemy. If you have control of the media, you can also implement a divide and conquer strategy. So if you can turn men against women, blacks against whites, heterosexuals against the LGBTQs, established populations against imported immigrants by the millions, all of that causes people to turn to their governments for interventions. Do you think those funding critical race theory to drag queen story time want harmony? No. They want culture wars and civil wars. In the USA, if one disagreed with the narrative, the media, the Department of Justice or FBI would label that individual either a domestic terrorist or white supremacist racist, regardless of their skin color. It was part of the plan to blame the destruction of the USA on white supremacists. But ponder this one example. The city of Oakland, California is deeply beset with crime and violence, but I would challenge you to find even one white supremacist in Oakland. Those behind the tyrannical cult we have been subjected to are not super intelligent, but few realize they get their power from public acquiescence, whose perceptions they have to control. Yes, the cult has a lot of financial resources and many deluded minions who will blindly do their bidding, but they are weak. Only the weak censor. The censorship was a desperate move to control perceptions, but the censorship surrounding COVID killed tens of thousands. So with a virus, you can stop people from gathering, organizing, and if you can digitize a population, you can control who is talking to whom and where. If you can get people to school online or do their work online, the government can listen to everything everyone is saying and writing and buying. The excuse is that it is für eure Sicherheit to protect against the invisible enemy. It also keeps people lonely, isolated, and depressed. People will buy into solutions before they know anything about the consequences of that solution. So you can mandate lockdowns without proper science supporting same, injections that have not been adequately tested, or vaccines that are known to cause harm for the greater good of someone's bottom line. Infectious disease skullduggery. This is not a comprehensive tome of infectious disease skullduggery, but in 1955 it has been reported that the CIA conducted an open-air biological warfare experiment near Tampa, Florida, and environs with the pertussis bacteria. It was alleged that the nasty endeavor tripled the whooping cough infections in Florida to over 1,000 cases and caused whooping cough deaths in the state to increase 12-fold over the previous year. In 1966, the U.S. Army released Bacillus globigii into the tunnels of the New York City subway system as part of a field experiment called a study of the vulnerability of subway passengers in New York City to covert attack with biological agents. The Chicago subway system was also subject to a similar experiment by the Army. Bacillus globigii was used to simulate an attack with anthrax, but as it turned out, now we know this bacteria is a human pathogen. The USA government conducted many radiation experiments on the unwary, MKUltra drug experiments on the unknowing, torture experiments on the incarcerated. But again, this is not meant to be a comprehensive list. By the time U.S. President Eisenhower left office with his infamous speech, "Beware, the military-industrial complex," we were being pushed into unending military conflicts, often initiated by false flag events such as the Gulf of Tonkin incident that was used to start the Vietnam War. Men in Black. In the 1950s, the CIA had split into two factions. The Western faction was almost exclusively in control of anything that had to do with ETs. I don't mention this to be sensational. In the years that followed, the military-industrial paradigm evolved and became inclusive of many multinational corporations, investment houses, and banks, which benefited from this arrangement, leading to where we have massive corporate interests such as BlackRock, Vanguard, which span the globe and whose shareholderships are networked among a very small oligarch class. While President Roosevelt avoided a coup, President John F. Kennedy did not, and was assassinated in 1963 in a coordinated plot managed by the CIA's E. Howard Hunt. Lyndon B. Johnson was vice president and was fully aware of the planned elimination of JFK, as was the infamous director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Apparently, America decided to explore the dark side and so begin unending wars and skullduggery around the globe. But I doubt this could have been possible without the cooperation of the press, in covering up the facts of the event. Why was Kennedy assassinated? Kennedy wanted the USA back on the gold standard. He wanted the CIA dismantled. He never wanted the USA to get entangled in Vietnam. Unbeknownst to Kennedy, the CIA had become far more than the CIA. They were literally the men in black in matters extraterrestrial, and if the CIA was threatened, it also threatened the cover being used in such matters and the monopoly of information the CIA had on this information. Kennedy had a vision for the space program, but his vision was not shared by those using NASA as a front organization for their secret space program. They were back engineering crashed vehicles, probably with the help of low-vibrational ETs, but that is speculation. Just days before his murder, Kennedy signed an agreement with Khrushchev to cooperate on moon exploration and signed an executive order requesting the CIA share what they knew about UFOs to make sure there were no accidents from confusing UFOs with an aggressive act by either side. The CIA had no intention of sharing anything with anyone, and certainly wasn't going to let the chief executive tell them what to do, even if that meant making him wet. Meanwhile, the secret biowarfare facility located on Plum Island off the coast of Connecticut was developing an enhanced version of the Borrelia bacteria, Lyme disease, under the directorship of former German SS officer and microbiologist Erich Traub, gain-of-function research. This organism with increased virulence now infects 20% of the world's population. Be that as it may, the virulence of the organism was not robust enough for the globalists. The fall guy set up to take the blame for the JFK assassination was CIA asset Lee Harvey Oswald, who strangely enough was mixed up in a virus gain-of-function program for the purpose of developing a weapon that would kill Fidel Castro. Oswald knew too much and was expendable, so he was a convenient patsy. Mary Sherman, the scientist running the program, was murdered. It is still speculation whether there was a link to this apparent effort to create a deadly virus and the subsequent identification and possible enhancement of the HIV virus. Maurice Hillerman, one of the world's most prominent virologists of his time and a vice president of Merck, was recorded boasting, "So we brought African greens in, and I didn't know we were importing the AIDS virus at the time." Merck switched from Indian rhesus to green monkeys because the rhesus monkey were full of retroviruses, including SV40. Was HIV just due to sloppy virology, or was HIV, once identified, manipulated, and chosen as a bioweapon? A weapon that must have been a big disappointment as it took far too long to kill its victims. Intentional or not, in all likelihood it was introduced in the USA via the hepatitis B vaccine trials that exclusively recruited gay men in New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. The bottom line is that vaccinologists in the 20th century were creating invasive medical interventions with no clue as to what they were doing, and as a result murdered many. Or did they know what they were doing? The situation in Africa is a little less clear starting in 1957. Oral polio vaccines were administered by the Wistar Institute and given to hundreds of thousands of Africans. As with almost all vaccines, there was no follow-up. The FDA has archived vaccines from that period, and if they forensically looked at them to see if HIV was present, they have not told anyone. That would eliminate the conspiracy theories, but it would also implicate the whole vaccine program as a very problematic, unethical, and sloppy endeavor, to say the least. Big Pharma in the USA was able to get unconditional liability protection from lawsuits related to adverse events from their vaccines in 1986. Safety was no longer their concern, as the responsibility of vaccine safety was now the responsibility of the U.S. government. So there was an explosion of vaccines required for children, and a mysterious increase in sudden infant death syndrome, chronic health conditions, and a formerly rare neurological disorder called autism. Autism is a post-vaccination encephalitis, but the connection between vaccines, mercury, aluminum, found in 80% of vaccines at toxic levels, acetaminophen, and autism, was deliberately covered up by agencies of the U.S. government. When the CDC had the objective data, the vaccines were connected to autism. The response was to shred the data. A high-level whistleblower came forward and disclosed this, but no one in government did anything. No hearings, no investigation, nothing. This was the subject of the documentary Vaxxed. Big Pharma was already well on their way to capturing regulatory agencies and politicians. No one in the upper echelons of government would dare reveal what they knew, and they never did. However, that silence empowered the eugenics cult. The U.S. government never met their obligations under the 1986 Vaccine Act and ignored all safety issues, even as they pushed the mantra, safe and effective, so that by the time COVID-2 showed up, the population was good and indoctrinated. Health and Human Services, HHS, already had decades of blowing off their responsibilities for vaccine safety, and few seemed to care. SARS-1, the predecessor to SARS-2, CoV-2, arrived on the scene in 2002 and in all likelihood was a test run. The reason one does not hear about it anymore is that it has no natural host and therefore not in circulation. If there is no natural host, then where did it come from? Is there wet market in the Wuhan virology lab? CoV-2 was made in the USA, but was sent to the Wuhan virology lab for enhancements that became illegal to do in the US. There is strong circumstantial evidence that AH1N1, the so-called novel Mexican swine flu event of 2009, was neither Mexican nor novel, but a genetically engineered creation from the USA. The virus included genetic bits of North American human, avian and swine flus, and Eurasian swine flu. The virus had not been detected in any pigs except those in a single herd in Canada. A variant of AH1N1 broke out in India in 2015, but has apparently not been a player since. No natural host. Had there been a sincere and honest attempt to flesh out the origins of these viruses, again, we would not be where we are today. While AH1N1 was very infectious, the virus was no more problematic than the normal flu virus and has vanished. It may have just been a test run for a future release. The destruction of the World Trade Center on 9/11 was another coup d'etat, this time by the neocon faction of the New World Order set. It greatly empowered them to have been able to get away with that event, firing a missile into the Pentagon but telling everyone it was a 757 jet, the overt demolishing of WTC-7, no plane hit this building, and clear evidence WTC-1 and 2 were demolished. It was carried off by traders within the USA in conjunction with several Middle Eastern countries. Much could be said here about the horrors unleashed post-coup d'etat, but no one in officialdom would dare speak the obvious truths. It really set the stage for what would be coming soon enough. And what was that? The continued neocon agenda to take over Eastern Europe in violation of the agreement made with Gorbachev that there would be no expansion into Eastern Europe by NATO if the Warsaw Pact was dissolved. The attempt to scare the world with the Zika virus was a really big flop. They would not make that mistake again. So quick to blame a relatively benign virus for the clusters of microcephaly in Brazil. However, too many found out fairly quickly that the pocket of mothers in Brazil who gave birth to children with microcephaly were vaccinated with DTP while pregnant and while drinking larvicide-laden tap water at the same time. So that attempt to scare the world had to be shut down immediately because a vaccine was clearly implicated. At the same time, a Sentinel paper was published, a retrospective look, using matched controls, at 30 years of DPT use in Africa, showing an increased overall mortality tenfold. So it was very important to shut down any interest in looking at the safety and efficacy of the DPT. Which brings us to COVID-2 and the announcement by Dr. Fauci in 2017 that a surprise outbreak was imminent. The plot was apparently hatched as far back as 1999 at the University of North Carolina. In the subsequent years, numerous white papers, such as SARS 2025-2028, the pandemic war games, such as Event 201, which were priming both the media and the public. Finally, they would have the event that would allow them to bring in their great reset of the world economy and cull the population at the same time. Key players in multiple governments had already been compromised, regulatory agencies had been captured, and Big Pharma, along with Big Tech, were in total control of conventional media outlets. Yet COVID-2 virus was not an infectious disease hellion. It took out the old and the infirm, just like influenza does every year, so the hype had to go into overdrive, which the PCR tests accomplished, cycled so high clean swabs would test positive. It was critical the number of deaths for CoV-2 to be very high in order to generate the fear to justify what would come next. So, despite long-standing rules for data collection and reporting, Suddenly, CDC changed the way they wanted deaths reported. Had they used the normal criteria, the mortality figures would have had to be revised down 90%. The very people within government who might have sounded the alarm that we were being manipulated into a biosecurity state based on false information were compromised, as many of them would be able to earn millions of dollars from the licensing of the mRNA technology. It has been determined that almost half of all PCR results were false positives, which, if nothing else, calls into question the clinical trials used to validate the vaccine. As an aside, we have never had a vaccine that makes the human body create a pathogen in a controlled way for an uncontrolled duration. The spike protein is a significant pathogen, a loaded weapon, if you will, with no assurance it would control the outbreak. What happened next was 50 countries panicked and were cajoled into signing secret agreements with Pfizer, essentially putting them into receivership in exchange for the injections and monetary assistance from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. An agreement to remain secret for 50 years. Any criticism of the injections or of Pfizer would be forbidden. Pfizer would not only direct the global response, but also the response individual countries would have, so a worldwide extermination system could be initiated. The Federal Drug Administration, FDA, now under operational control of the Department of Defense, DoD, even asked a federal court to allow them 55 years to hold on to the data they relied on to give emergency use authorization for the Pfizer injection. There can only be one reason for this request, and that is the FDA DoD didn't want anyone to see that the Pfizer data showed that at best one would have to inject 22,000 people to potentially prevent one death. No need to point out the Wuhan A strain was no longer in circulation. I am also sure they didn't want anyone to see that there were more deaths in the injected group than in the control group. The lack of early prevention and treatment protocols and the persecution of anyone trying to treat COVID patients prior to hospitalization was not a form of treatment nihilism. It was a well-organized, well-funded conspiracy to make sure nothing would interfere with an injection rollout. Never have sick patients been turned away from hospitals and told to come back when their lips were blue. All the big players were deeply, corruptly, and maliciously in bed with pharma, so would lose billions if it were found off-patent drugs could treat COVID. The FDA, under the direction of the Department of Defense, illegally exercised emergency use powers and was a willing ally in the suppression of treatments known to be effective against the virus, such as something as benign as vitamin D. In some countries, physicians were arrested for prescribing ivermectin. Then injections were illegally marketed to children as well after the FDA advisory panelists said, "We're never going to learn about how safe the vaccine is until we start giving it," said panel member Dr. Eric Rubin. "That's just the way it goes." No, Dr. Rubin, that is not the way it goes. When you ignore safety, you tend to ignore whether the injection even works. And while the science is moving forward, unfortunately, deluded technocrats were not. The FDA stopped being a regulatory agency and became part of the other alphabet agencies to promote the vaccine. They saw their role was to get a needle in every arm, in everyone in every country. It was choreography to dance to the edicts of the DoD. Pfizer now had the power to silence governments, maximize profits and power. Military bases, national parks, just a few of the items signed over. Big Tech and Pharma had bled out multiple governments to create this giant one-world government monster with Pfizer calling the shots, literally. The human infestation would be eliminated with the silent, obedient consent of governments around the world. Original antigenic sin, but there were problems. The injection was going to kill too many too fast as intended. Even though many of the injections were expired and ineffective, they were thawed for too long, and many blanks were shipped to many locations to mitigate the number of adverse events anticipated. Nevertheless, the body count increased as well, hidden as those bodies may have been. They had to buffer the rollout of the injection because, again, it was supposed to have come on the scene after billions were already dead from CoV-2, and few would be left to ask important questions. One question was, why give a non-sterilizing vaccine to everyone possible in the middle of a pandemic? All that would do is prolong the length of illness, by pumping out a multitude of variants, which is exactly what took place. They were called variants because they had a different spike protein than the one the injection was having the human body manufacture, and so the efficacy of the injection started falling into the single digits. This was all predicted well in advance, but the injections were rushed for socio-political reasons, not medical/scientific reasons. Compare and contrast what took place in Gibraltar versus Africa. Africa, a heavy user of hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, taken by millions. By the end 2021, the vaccination rates in 20 African countries wasn't even close to coming out of the single digits. Overall, the African vaccination rate was around 6%, but for some reason the experts were mystified as to why there is so little COVID in Africa. On the other hand, perhaps the most vaccinated country on the planet was Gibraltar, where there is a 100% plus vaccination rate, and yet cases of COVID were so high Christmas 2021 was cancelled. Unintentionally, they proved boosters don't work. In Singapore, with a 94% vaccination rate, cases and mortality spiked to record levels. And in Ireland, where 92% of the adult population is vaccinated, cases and mortality doubled. England was the only country worldwide that seemed to keep accurate records of its deaths by vaccination status, at least for a while. The COVID vaccines used in England, mRNA and DNA vector vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca, do not significantly reduce COVID mortality, but did result in greatly increased all-cause mortality. Specifically in England, if you are under 60 and you get injected, you are twice as likely to die. As the months went by, the mortality of the injected only increased. The mortality from COVID in an African country, such as Zaire, was 0.6 per 100,000. Almost no one received the injection. In the USA, the mortality was 1,000 per 100,000. There should be no need to read one more word if you understand the obvious implications of that last sentence. Even before President Trump announced he had taken HCQ, the drug was disappearing and countries were removing it from over-the-counter status and requiring prescriptions. Someone didn't want HCQ to be around, and studies were being conducted with near-lethal doses of HCQ in late-stage patients. No zinc, no azithromycin. It was as if someone deliberately wanted to destroy any chance HCQ might have to help treat COVID patients. Then perhaps one of the most momentous medical frauds in history took place. Both the New England Journal of Medicine and The Lancet simultaneously published completely fabricated fictional articles that concluded HCQ was not efficacious. What someones had the power to fund fraudulent studies, compromise the world's top medical journals, and then get the Federal Drug Administration, FDA, to pull the Emergency Use Authorization, EUA, for HCQ? Apparently, that was the FTX group. Even after the papers were retracted, the FDA did not reinstate the EUA. This brings up the problem that there is no FDA. The DoD took over the FDA regarding all things COVID. However, those who successfully destroyed the possibility of using HCQ for COVID weren't done. They went after ivermectin, but not with the same success. This is the end of Part 2.